In the call of the wild ember's legacy, Jake Thornton, a retired firefighter, rescues a wounded wolf, Ember, from a devastating wildfire in Montana. The bond between man and wolf grows stronger as Jake heals Ember, only to discover the wolf's rare lineage and the challenges of keeping a protected species. When wildfires strike again, Ember's bravery saves lives but comes at a great cost, forcing Jake to fight for the wolf's future. Ultimately, Ember returns to the wild, where he starts a family, while Jake creates a sanctuary to protect displaced wildlife. Their journey of trust, sacrifice, and mutual healing inspires a deeper understanding of the bond between humans and nature. What did you think of the call of the wild Ember's legacy? Share your thoughts in the comments and tell us where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to DG Story for more captivating tales of courage, love, and inspiration. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of burning trees choking the landscape as flames devoured the Montana forest. Jake Thornton gripped the steering wheel of his old pickup truck, his knuckles white. He hadn't driven this deep into Bitterroot Forest in years. But the wildfire spreading faster than expected had forced emergency responders to call for help, even from those no longer on the active roster. Jake wasn't supposed to be here. After retiring as a firefighter 3 years ago due to injuries, both physical and emotional, he had retreated to a solitary life in a cabin nestled on the outskirts of the forest. But when the call for volunteers came in, a sense of duty he thought he'd buried pulled him back into the chaos. As he drove down the narrow dirt road, Jake's eyes caught movement through the smoky haze. A large figure staggered onto the road, collapsing just ahead of his headlights. Slamming the brakes, Jake threw the truck into park and jumped out. It wasn't a person, but an animal, something big, with a coat of singed fur that glimmered faintly in the dim light. At first, Jake thought it was a dog, but as he got closer, he saw the animal's massive frame and sharp, intelligent eyes. The creature lay sprawled on the ground, its chest rising and falling with labored breaths. One of its legs was bent unnaturally, and its fur was matted with blood and soot. Jake crouched beside it, his firefighter instincts taking over. "Hey there, buddy," he said softly, his voice steady despite the roar of flames in the distance. "I'm here to help." The animal flinched, baring its teeth in a weak snarl, but it didn't have the energy to resist. Jake hesitated only a moment before pulling off his jacket and draping it over the creature to shield it from the falling ash. Carefully, he slid his arms underneath its body and lifted it. The weight was more than he expected, and the heat pressing down on him was suffocating. Every step back to the truck felt like a battle, but Jake gritted his teeth and pushed through. He placed the animal gently on the passenger seat, its head lolling weakly against the headrest. "Hold on," Jake muttered, climbing back into the driver's seat. "We'll get you out of here." The drive back to his cabin was tense. The forest around him was alive with chaos, flames crackling, trees groaning as they gave way, and the distant wail of sirens. Jake's thoughts raced as he glanced at the creature beside him. He didn't know why he felt so compelled to save it. Maybe it was the look in its eyes, that raw mix of fear and determination. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, Jake felt like he was doing something that mattered. By the time they reached the cabin, night had fallen. Jake carried the animal inside, laying it on an old blanket by the fireplace. The creature whimpered softly, its golden eyes flickering open to watch him. "You're safe now," Jake said, brushing ash off its fur. "I'll take care of you." He didn't know then how much those words would come to mean. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Jake's cabin, casting long shadows across the room. The animal lay where Jake had placed it the night before, its chest rising and falling steadily now. Jake crouched nearby, inspecting the injured leg. It wasn't a clean break, but it was bad enough to require attention. Jake had dealt with worse during his years as a firefighter and first responder, though never on a creature this size. "Let's see what we can do here," he muttered, grabbing a first aid kit from the shelf. The animal's ears flicked at the sound of his voice, his golden eyes snapping open, tensed immediately, baring its teeth in a low growl. "Easy," Jake said, holding his hands up in a calming gesture. "I'm not going to hurt you." The growl subsided into a soft whimper as the animal's body relaxed, though its gaze remained sharp and wary. Jake worked slowly, cleaning the wound and splinting the leg as best he could. The animal flinched a few times but didn't resist. "There," Jake said when he finished, stepping back. "That should hold for now." He sat down on the floor a few feet away, leaning against the wall. For a long time, neither of them moved. Jake studied the animal, noting the unusual blend of colors in its fur, golden brown streaked with silver and black. The size, too, was striking, larger than any dog he'd seen. "Not a dog, are you?" Jake said quietly. The animal blinked at him, its eyes filled with something almost intelligent. Jake shook his head, running a hand through his messy hair. He spent the rest of the day tending to the creature and working around the cabin. Every so often, he would catch it watching him, its eyes tracking his movements with quiet intensity. By evening, Jake decided to try feeding it. He placed a bowl of water and a plate of leftover venison stew on the floor a few feet away. The animal hesitated, sniffing the air before inching closer. It ate cautiously, its movements deliberate and careful. "Good," Jake murmured. "You've got some fight in you. That's a good sign." As the days passed, a fragile bond began to form. The animal allowed Jake to get closer, no longer growling when he approached. It still watched him with wary eyes, but there was a subtle shift, an unspoken understanding that Jake meant no harm. One morning, as Jake was chopping firewood outside, he heard a soft thud behind him. He turned to see the animal standing in the doorway, its injured leg held slightly off the ground. "Well, look who's up," Jake said, setting down the axe. The creature limped toward him, sniffing the air cautiously. Jake stayed still, letting it approach on its own terms. Finally, it stopped a few feet away, its golden eyes locked onto his. "You're a stubborn one." "Ha!" Jake said with a small smile. "Guess we've got that in common." The animal huffed softly, almost like it understood. By the end of the week, Jake decided it was time to call someone who might know more about what he was dealing with. He picked up his old phone and dialed a familiar number. "Sarah, it's Jake," he said when the call connected. "I've got a situation here. You mind coming by?" That afternoon, Sarah Reed arrived at the cabin, a wildlife biologist and Jake's closest neighbor. She was one of the few people he trusted. As soon as she stepped inside and saw the creature lying by the fireplace, her eyes widened. "Jake, that's not a dog," she said, crouching to get a closer look. "I figured that much," Jake said. "So what is it?" Sarah studied the creature for a moment before standing. "It's a wolf, a big one, and not just any wolf. It looks like a timber wolf, maybe even a mix of something else." "Where did you find it?" "In the fire," Jake replied, crossing his arms. "It was trapped. I couldn't just leave it there." Sarah sighed, her expression a mix of concern and curiosity. "Jake, you know it's illegal to keep a wolf, right? They're protected under federal law." "I know," Jake said, his jaw tightening. "But it was hurt. If I hadn't brought it here, it would have died." "I get it," Sarah said gently. "But if anyone finds out, you could be in serious trouble. And it's not just the law, you're dealing with a wild animal. They're unpredictable." Jake glanced at the wolf, which was now watching them intently. "It doesn't feel wild," he said. "Not anymore." Sarah shook her head. "It might trust you now, but that doesn't mean it's safe. You need to be careful." "Jake, I'll figure it out," Jake said, his voice firm. As Sarah left, Jake returned to the fireplace and sat down across from the wolf. "Looks like you're more trouble than I thought," he said with a small smirk. The wolf let out a low whine, its eyes flickering with something that almost resembled amusement. Yeah, Jake muttered. Guess we'll see where this goes. The wolf Ember, as Jake had started calling it, was healing faster than expected. Within a week, it was hobbling around the cabin on its injured leg, sniffing every corner like it was mapping the space. Jake found himself watching Ember with fascination. The way it moved, calculated and deliberate, was unlike any animal he had encountered. One morning, Sarah returned to the cabin carrying a leather bag and a concerned expression. "I've been doing some research," she said as she stepped inside, setting the bag on Jake's worn wooden table. Jake raised an eyebrow. "About Ember?" Sarah nodded, pulling out a stack of printed documents and photos. She laid them out in front of Jake. "Look at this." The images were of wolves, large, powerful creatures with sleek coats and piercing eyes, but none of them looked quite like Ember. "This is what's been bothering me," Sarah said, tapping on one of the photos. "Most timber wolves in this area are smaller, with a grayer coat. Ember's size, its coloring, it's different. And then there's this." She pulled out a close-up photo of Ember's paw, which she had taken during her last visit. She placed it next to a diagram of wolf tracks. "See the size? This isn't just a regular wolf. It might be a hybrid or what?" Jake asked, leaning closer. Sarah hesitated before continuing. "Or it could belong to a subspecies thought to be extinct. The High Plains wolf. They were larger, more resilient, and extremely rare even before they disappeared over a century ago." Jake stared at her, processing the information. "You're saying Ember's special?" "More than special," Sarah replied. "If this really is a High Plains wolf, it's a genetic treasure. Scientists would kill for a chance to study it." The word kill hung in the air, sending a chill down Jake's spine. He glanced at Ember, who was lying near the fireplace, its golden eyes watching them. "I'm not letting anyone take Ember," Jake said firmly. "Jake," Sarah said softly, "I understand how you feel, but this isn't just about you. This animal could be the key to understanding a species we thought was gone forever." Jake shook his head. "I don't care what it is to them. To me, it's Ember, and I'm not handing it over to a lab." Before Sarah could respond, a loud bang echoed from outside. Jake's instincts kicked in immediately. He grabbed the rifle hanging by the door and gestured for Sarah to stay put. When he stepped onto the porch, his heart sank. Two men were standing near the edge of the property, one holding a camera and the other a rifle. "Can I help you?" Jake called, his tone sharp. The man with the camera grinned. "We heard you've got something interesting in there." Jake's grip tightened on the rifle. "This is private property. You need to leave." The second man stepped forward, resting his hand on his weapon. "We're just here to take a look. No harm in that, right?" "I'm only going to say this once," Jake said, his voice low and steady. "Get off my land." The men exchanged a look before backing away, but not before the cameraman raised his device and snapped a photo of Jake. When Jake returned inside, Sarah's expression was grim. "Who were they?" she asked. "Trouble," Jake muttered, setting the rifle aside. Jake couldn't sleep. He sat by the fireplace, staring into the flickering flames while Ember lay nearby, his head resting on its paws. The encounter with the two men had left him uneasy. "Looks like you're famous now," Jake said, glancing at Ember. The wolf huffed softly, almost like it understood. Jake sighed. "They're not going to stop, are they? People like that, they see something rare, something they don't understand, and all they want to do is take it." Ember lifted its head, its golden eyes locking onto Jake's. There was something in its gaze, a depth, a clarity that made Jake feel like he wasn't just talking to an animal. "They won't take you," Jake said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." But even as he spoke, a part of him knew the situation was spiraling out of control. Ember wasn't just a wolf, it was a symbol of something much larger, and Jake had no idea how to protect it from the world that was closing in. By the next morning, the peaceful solitude of Jake's cabin was shattered. Two trucks and an official-looking SUV rolled up his driveway. their arrival heralded by the crunch of tires on gravel. Jake stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand but pointed downward, as three figures climbed out of the vehicles. Leading the group was a man in his late 40s with sharp features and a wildlife enforcement patch on his jacket. Behind him were two assistants, one holding a clipboard and the other a tranquilizer rifle. "Mr. Thornton?" the man asked, his tone professional but firm. "That's me," Jake replied, squinting against the morning sun. "I'm Officer Mark Langley with Wildlife Enforcement," the man said, pulling out a badge. "We've received reports that you're harboring a wolf on this property." Jake's jaw tightened. "I'm taking care of an injured animal. That's all." Langley gave him a measured look. "A wolf is not just an animal, Mr. Thornton. It's a federally protected species. Keeping one without a proper permit is illegal." Jake stepped down from the porch, his shoulders squared. "So what are you here for?" "To take it." Langley held up a hand. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm here to assess the situation. If you've been caring for a wild animal, we'll work with you to ensure it's relocated to a proper facility." "I'm not handing it over," Jake said flatly. Langley sighed, pulling a form from his clipboard. "You don't have a choice. Under the Endangered Species Act, wolves belong in the wild or a licensed sanctuary, not in someone's cabin." Before Jake could respond, Ember appeared in the doorway. The wolf stood tall despite its still healing leg, its golden eyes locked on the intruders. One of the assistants instinctively raised the tranquilizer rifle, but Jake stepped in front of Ember. "Lower that," Jake growled, his voice dangerous. The assistant hesitated but obeyed as Langley gave a sharp nod. Langley's gaze shifted to Ember. "That's quite the specimen," he said, almost to himself. "Definitely not an ordinary wolf." Jake crossed his arms. "What's that supposed to mean?" Langley ignored the question, turning back to Jake. "Here's the deal. You've got 3 weeks to apply for a wildlife caretaker's permit and relocate to a property that meets federal standards. If you fail to comply, we'll have to seize the wolf and transfer it to a sanctuary." Jake's fists clenched, but he forced himself to remain calm. 3 weeks, he repeated. 3 weeks, Langley confirmed. "And for your sake, I'd recommend keeping the wolf out of sight. If more reports come in, we won't be so lenient next time." With that, the group retreated to their vehicles and drove away, leaving Jake standing on the porch, his mind racing. As the days passed, Jake threw himself into action. He contacted real estate agents, searching for a property far enough from prying eyes but close enough to maintain his ties to the area. Every spare moment was spent planning, calculating, and building. Sarah became his partner in the endeavor, offering advice and support. "You're doing the right thing," she said one evening as they pored over blueprints for a large enclosure. "Doesn't feel like it," Jake muttered, glancing at Ember, who was lying near the fireplace. "Feels like I'm being forced to give up what's best for him." Sarah placed a hand on his shoulder. "You're fighting for him, Jake. That's more than most people would do." Despite their progress, the pressure weighed heavily on Jake. The media had picked up on the story, thanks to the photo taken by the trespassers. Headlines ranged from "Heroic Firefighter Saves Rare Wolf" to "Man Endangers Community by Harboring Wild Animal." The conflicting narratives only added fuel to the fire, and Jake found himself the subject of both praise and criticism. One night, as Jake was working on the new property, a small stretch of land he had purchased deep in the woods, he heard rustling nearby. Grabbing a flashlight, he moved cautiously toward the sound. What he found made his blood run cold. A group of men, the same ones from before, were prowling near the partially constructed enclosure. This time, they weren't just taking photos, they were setting traps. Jake stepped into the beam of their flashlights, his rifle slung over his shoulder. "You've got about 10 seconds to leave," he said, his voice ice cold. The leader of the group smirked. "We're not doing anything illegal, Thornton, just protecting the area." "From what?" Jake snapped, "From a predator that doesn't belong here," the man replied, his tone mocking. Jake raised the rifle, aiming just above the man's head. "You've got 5 seconds." The group scattered, muttering curses as they disappeared into the woods. When Jake returned to the cabin, Ember was waiting by the door. The wolf nudged Jake's hand with its nose, as if sensing his frustration. "They're not going to stop," Jake said quietly, crouching to meet Ember's gaze. "But neither am I." The air was thick with smoke again, just as it had been the day Jake found Ember. This time, however, the wildfire was even closer, threatening not just the forest but the town nestled at its edge. Jake's phone buzzed incessantly with alerts, evacuation orders, warnings, and pleas for help. He stood on the porch of his half-finished sanctuary, staring at the orange glow on the horizon. Ember stood beside him, ears pricked and body tense. "We've got to move," Jake muttered, grabbing his emergency bag. But as he turned toward the truck, a call came in. It was Sarah. "Jake." Her voice crackled through the static. "A family is trapped in the canyon near the fire line. They need help, but the responders can't get to them in time." Jake's grip tightened on the phone. "Where exactly?" "North side of Bitterroot Canyon," Sarah said. "Jake, it's bad. They've got kids with them." Jake glanced at Ember, who was watching him intently. He didn't need to say a word. The wolf already seemed to understand. "We're going," Jake said, ending the call. The drive to the canyon was tense, the road shrouded in smoke and ash. Embers floated through the air like fiery snowflakes, landing on the truck's hood and sizzling against the metal. When they reached the edge of the canyon, Jake parked and grabbed a flashlight, a rope, and a medical kit. Ember leapt gracefully from the truck, its injured leg showing only the faintest limp now. "Stay close," Jake said as they descended into the smoke-filled ravine. The heat was oppressive, and the roar of the fire drowned out everything else. Jake moved quickly, scanning for any sign of the trapped family. Ember darted ahead, its nose to the ground, sniffing through the chaos. Suddenly, the wolf stopped, its body rigid. It let out a sharp bark, drawing Jake's attention. "What is it?" Jake called, moving toward the wolf. Through the haze, he saw the outline of a collapsed structure, a small, wooden cabin, its roof partially caved in. From inside, faint cries for help reached Jake's ears. "Good boy," Jake muttered, rushing to the cabin. Inside the cabin, Jake found a woman and 2 children huddled in a corner. The woman's leg was pinned under a fallen beam, and the children clung to her, their faces streaked with soot and tears. "We're here to get you out," Jake said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The woman shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I can't move," she said, her voice trembling. "Just take the kids, please." Jake glanced at Ember, who was already nudging the children gently, encouraging them to stand. "Follow him," Jake said to the kids. "He'll lead you to safety." The children hesitated, their eyes wide with fear, but Ember's calm presence seemed to reassure them. They clung to each other as they followed the wolf out of the cabin. Jake turned back to the woman. "I'm not leaving without you," he said firmly, using every ounce of strength. He lifted the beam enough to free her leg. She cried out in pain but managed to wrap an arm around Jake's shoulders as he helped her to her feet. As they made their way out, the fire surged closer, devouring the dry brush with terrifying speed. The air was suffocating, each breath a struggle. Suddenly, the ground beneath them gave a violent shudder. Jake turned just in time to see a burning tree crashing toward them. "Move!" he shouted, shoving the woman forward. But it wasn't enough. The tree came down with a deafening crack, scattering embers and debris. Jake braced himself for the impact, but before it could hit, Ember lunged into action. The wolf slammed into Jake and the woman, knocking them clear of the falling tree. The branch crashed to the ground, sending a wave of heat and ash into the air. When the dust settled, Jake looked up to see Ember pinned beneath the burning wood, its body still. "No!" Jake shouted, scrambling toward the wolf. with a strength born of desperation. He lifted the branch and dragged Ember free. The wolf let out a low whimper, its golden eyes flickering weakly. "You're going to be okay," Jake said, his voice thick with emotion. "Just hold on." Jake carried Ember the rest of the way, his muscles burning with effort. When they emerged from the canyon, firefighters were waiting. The children were safe, huddled in blankets, and the woman was immediately taken to an ambulance. "Over here," Jake called, laying Ember on the ground. A medic rushed over, examining the wolf with a mix of awe and concern. "We'll do what we can," she said, loading Ember into a truck. Jake watched as the vehicle disappeared into the smoke, his chest tight with worry. "You saved them." Sarah's voice came from behind him. She had arrived just in time to witness the scene. "You and Ember, you did it." Jake shook his head, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Not yet," he said quietly. The wildfire was finally under control, but the scars it left were everywhere. Charred trees stretched into the horizon like skeletal remains, and the acrid scent of smoke still lingered in the air. Jake sat outside the veterinary clinic, his hands clasped tightly together as he waited for news. Inside, Ember was undergoing surgery to treat its burns and the damage to its leg. The door to the clinic swung open, and Dr. Bennett, the veterinarian, stepped out. She looked tired but gave Jake a reassuring nod. "Ember's stable," she said. "It was touch and go for a while, but he's strong. He'll pull through." Jake exhaled a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. Dr. Bennett placed a hand on his shoulder. "He's lucky to have you. Most wolves wouldn't survive injuries like this, let alone the kind of trauma he's been through." Jake nodded, his relief tempered by the reality of what lay ahead. Ember might have survived the fire, but their fight was far from over. 2 days later, Jake found himself in a small courtroom packed with reporters, conservationists, and local officials. On one side sat Lucas Hayes, the head of a prominent wildlife advocacy group, flanked by lawyers and experts. On the other, Jake sat alone, his face calm but his hands clenched tightly in his lap. "Mr. Thornton," Hayes began, standing to address the court, "we understand your intentions were noble, but the law is clear. Wolves are protected under the Endangered Species Act. Keeping one in captivity, regardless of the circumstances, is a violation." Jake rose, his gaze steady. "I didn't keep Ember to defy the law. I saved him because he would have died otherwise. And everything I've done since then has been to ensure his safety." The judge interjected. "The question here is not your intentions, Mr. Thornton, but whether Ember's current situation is in his best interest and whether it complies with federal regulations." Hayes seized the moment. This wolf belongs in the wild, where he can contribute to the ecosystem and potentially aid in the preservation of his species. Keeping him confined, even with the best intentions, is irresponsible. Jake's jaw tightened. "And you think dumping him in the wild is responsible? He's been injured, nearly killed, and he trusts me. You take him away now, and you're sentencing him to death." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, the tension thick in the air. As the proceedings continued, Sarah took the stand as a witness for Jake. She spoke passionately about Ember's unique qualities, his rare lineage, and the bond he shared with Jake. "This isn't just a case of a man keeping a wild animal," Sarah said. "This is about a connection that saved both of their lives. Jake gave Ember a chance to survive, and Ember has done the same for him. They're not just man and wolf, they're partners." Hayes countered with data and expert testimonies about the dangers of human interaction with wild animals, emphasizing the importance of keeping them in their natural habitats. But the courtroom took a dramatic turn when the family Jake and Ember had saved during the fire entered the room. The children ran up to Jake, hugging him tightly, while their mother spoke to the judge. "Without Jake and that wolf," she said, her voice trembling, "we wouldn't be here today. Ember isn't just an animal, he's a hero, and heroes deserve to be protected." After hours of deliberation, The judge called the courtroom to order. The room fell silent as everyone leaned forward, hanging on every word. "Mr. Thornton," the judge began, "your actions were undoubtedly courageous, and your bond with this wolf is extraordinary. However, the law exists to protect these animals and ensure their survival as a species. Therefore, I am ruling that Ember be transferred to a licensed sanctuary where he can be cared for in a manner consistent with federal regulations." Jake felt the weight of the words hit him like a punch to the gut. The judge continued, "That said, given the unique circumstances, I am granting a 30-day transition period to ensure Ember's health and safety. During this time, you will work with wildlife officials to prepare for his relocation." Jake returned to the clinic that evening, his heart heavy. Ember was awake, his leg wrapped in bandages, but his eyes lit up when he saw Jake. "Hey, buddy," Jake said softly. Kneeling beside the wolf, he rested a hand on Ember's head, feeling the warmth of its fur beneath his palm. "They're saying we only have a month." Ember blinked slowly, leaning into Jake's touch. Jake chuckled bitterly. "You don't even know what's going on, do you? Or maybe you do. You always seem to know." For the next few weeks, Jake poured all his energy into making Ember's final days with him as meaningful as possible. They spent hours exploring the forest, Jake often talking aloud while Ember listened silently. It was as if they were savoring every moment, knowing it might be their last. But as the 30-day deadline approached, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't how their story was meant to end. The night before Ember was set to be transferred, Jake was startled awake by the sound of scratching at the door. He opened it to find Ember standing there, his eyes glowing in the moonlight. "What's wrong, boy?" Jake asked, stepping outside. Ember darted forward, stopping at the edge of the property and looking back as if urging Jake to follow. Jake grabbed a flashlight and followed Ember into the woods. They moved swiftly through the trees, the wolf leading the way with purpose. Jake's heart pounded, unsure of what Ember was trying to show him. When they reached a clearing, Ember stopped and let out a long, haunting howl. Jake froze as the sound echoed through the night. Moments later, the forest came alive with movement. Out of the shadows emerged another wolf. Then another, and another. They formed a loose circle around Jake and Ember, their eyes gleaming in the dark. Jake's breath caught. Ember wasn't just calling for help, he was calling his pack. Jake stood frozen in the moonlit clearing, his flashlight casting long, wavering shadows across the circle of wolves surrounding him. Ember stood tall beside him, his golden eyes calm yet commanding. The other wolves moved cautiously, their postures wary but curious. Jake whispered, "This is your family, isn't it?" Ember turned his head to meet Jake's gaze, his expression almost as if he understood. For a moment, Jake felt an overwhelming mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and a tinge of fear. The wolves didn't move closer, but they lingered, their presence undeniable. One of them, a large female with a silvery coat, stepped forward. Her eyes locked on Ember. The two wolves sniffed each other briefly, their body language filled with unspoken communication. Jake watched in awe as Ember began to interact with the pack. It was clear he belonged here, among his kind. Yet when the female wolf turned to retreat into the forest, Ember hesitated. He looked back at Jake, his eyes filled with the same quiet trust they'd shared since that first day. "You're not sure, are you?" Jake said softly. "You've been with me for so long. You don't know how to leave." The wolves began to disperse, melting into the shadows one by one. Ember remained rooted in place, torn between his instincts and the bond he'd formed with Jake. "Go," Jake whispered, his voice breaking. "You deserve this." But Ember didn't move. Instead, he trotted back to Jake and pressed his head against his chest. Jake knelt, wrapping his arms around the wolf, his throat tight with emotion. "You've already given me more than I ever deserved," Jake murmured. "It's okay to go." The next morning, Jake woke to find Ember lying at the foot of his bed, just as he had every night since coming to the cabin. For a moment, Jake allowed himself to imagine a world where Ember could stay forever. But reality came crashing back as the sound of a vehicle pulling into the driveway shattered the quiet. Jake rose, his heart heavy, and stepped outside to greet the wildlife officials who had arrived to transport Ember to the sanctuary. Langley climbed out of the SUV, clipboard in hand. His expression was neutral but not unkind. "Morning, Mr. Thornton. Is the wolf ready?" Jake nodded slowly. "Yeah, he's ready." Inside, Ember stood by the door, his posture calm but his eyes watchful. Jake crouched beside him, placing a hand on his head. "This is it, buddy," he said. "No matter what happens, you'll always be my family." Ember licked Jake's hand, a rare and gentle gesture that nearly broke him. As Jake led Ember to the waiting transport crate, Sarah arrived, her face pale but resolute. "I'm coming with you," she told Jake. Jake didn't argue. He needed her support now more than ever. The drive to the sanctuary was silent except for the hum of the engine. Jake sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window while Sarah drove. In the back, Ember lay in the crate, his golden eyes occasionally meeting Jake's through the small grate. "You're doing the right thing," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. "It doesn't feel right," Jake replied, his voice low. "It feels like I'm abandoning him." "You're not," Sarah insisted. "You're giving him a chance to live the life he was meant to have." Jake didn't respond, his thoughts a storm of regret and doubt. When they arrived at the sanctuary, they were greeted by a team of biologists and caretakers. The facility was expansive, with acres of open land designed to mimic the wolves' natural habitat. "This is one of the best sanctuaries in the country," Sarah assured him. "He'll be safe here." But Jake's heart ached as he watched Ember being led into the enclosure. The wolf paused at the gate, looking back at Jake one last time. Jake stepped forward, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "Go on, boy," he said. "You're free now." Ember hesitated, then turned and disappeared into the tall grass. The ride back to the cabin was somber. Jake stared out the window, the weight of Ember's absence settling heavily on him. But later that night, as he sat alone by the fireplace, something stirred deep within him. Ember's howl echoed in his memory, a reminder of the bond they'd shared and the lessons he'd learned. Jake made a decision. He wouldn't let Ember's departure mark the end of their story. Instead, he would honor it by dedicating himself to protecting animals like Ember, those caught between the wild and the human world. "Thank you, Ember," Jake whispered, staring into the flickering flames. "For everything." Weeks passed since Ember's departure, but his presence lingered in every corner of Jake's life. The cabin felt emptier, the forest quieter. Yet in the stillness, Jake found clarity. Ember had not only changed Jake's perspective on the world, but also given him a purpose. One morning, Jake stood on the porch of his cabin, watching the sunrise over the forest. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and earth. In his hand was a blueprint, a plan for something far greater than himself. Over the next few months, Jake worked tirelessly to transform his newly purchased property into a sanctuary for displaced and injured wildlife. With Sarah's help, he secured permits, built enclosures, and reached out to conservation groups for support. The sanctuary became a haven, starting with small animals, foxes, owls, and injured deer. But Jake's ultimate goal was to create a space where wolves like Ember could thrive without fear of poachers, laws, or human interference. The community initially viewed Jake's project with skepticism. Some still remembered the media frenzy surrounding Ember, and not everyone was convinced that Jake's efforts were altruistic. But as time went on, the sanctuary began to draw attention for the right reasons. Families visited to learn about the animals. Children listened to Jake's stories of courage and connection. And conservationists praised the sanctuary as a model for wildlife rehabilitation. One evening, as Jake was finishing up work on a new enclosure, he heard it, a long, haunting howl rising from the forest. His breath caught, and he froze, listening. The howl was unmistakable, It was Ember. Jake grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the woods, his heart pounding with a mix of hope and disbelief. He followed the sound, weaving through the trees until he reached a clearing bathed in moonlight. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was Ember. His coat gleamed under the pale light, his golden eyes locked on Jake. Beside him stood the silver-coated female wolf, and behind her, two smaller shapes, pups. Jake's chest tightened as he took in the sight. Ember hadn't just found his place among the wild. He had started a family. "You came back," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible. Ember stepped forward, closing the distance between them. He stopped a few feet away, his posture calm but watchful. Jake knelt, extending a hand, and for a moment, the two simply looked at each other. "Guess you wanted me to see this," Jake said, a small smile tugging at his lips. "To know you're okay." Ember let out a soft huff, then turned and padded back toward the trees. The female wolf and her pups followed, disappearing into the shadows. Jake stayed in the clearing long after they were gone, his heart full in a way he hadn't felt in years. The sight of Ember and his family reignited Jake's determination to protect what mattered. He expanded the sanctuary, creating larger, more natural habitats for wolves and other predators that struggled to coexist with humans. The sanctuary became a beacon of hope, attracting volunteers, donations, and recognition from conservation organizations. Jake's story, once polarizing, now inspired others to take action for wildlife. Sarah became his closest partner, working tirelessly alongside him. Together, they turned the sanctuary into more than just a safe haven. It became a place of education, teaching future generations about the importance of coexistence with nature. Years later, as Jake stood at the edge of the sanctuary, watching the sun set over the sprawling landscape, he heard a familiar sound. A long, mournful howl rose from the distant hills, echoed by others in the forest. Jake closed his eyes, a smile spreading across his face. "Thank you, Ember," he murmured, "for showing me the way." As the howls faded into the night, Jake turned and walked back to the sanctuary, knowing that Ember's spirit would always guide him.